Good evening, everybody. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Kuan School of Public Policy. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you here to this event where my friend Shashi Tharoor is going to speak to us. As usual, I'll make 3 quick points and before ceding the floor to Shashi. Shashi has agreed that he will speak for about 30 minutes because I told him that Indians like to ask questions. So you be ready for the Q&A. And he's, of course, brilliant in Q&A. So let me quickly make 3 points about Shashi. And I want to begin firstly by saying that he's a very dear old friend. We actually met in Singapore 35 years ago when he came here as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Representative in Singapore, doing a very difficult job because at that time the Vietnamese boat people were all over Southeast Asia, and Singapore had a very tough job of keeping them out of Singapore, and I had to defend a difficult policy for which we were being criticized. And so even though we were arguing with each other, and of course when 2 Indians argue with each other, they end up being very good friends. And since then, our paths have crossed. When I was serving as ambassador to the UN, I would run into Shashi. And then, of course, every time I saw him, he kept rising. And as you know, ended up in politics in India. And he's currently the MP from Kerala. The second point I'm going to make about Shashi is that, he, of course, started life as a bureaucrat. And bureaucrats tend to be dull, except those who graduate from the Kuan School, of course. But Shashi is amazing because, he's ended up, there are very few people who move from being a bureaucrat to becoming a celebrity. And that's essentially what Shashi Tharoor is today. And if you have any doubts about this, just go to YouTube and just see how many videos you can download of him. And for example, he gave a wonderful speech at the Oxford Union debate on how wonderful the British Empire was for India. It was a gift to India, he said. Or maybe I got it wrong. Maybe it's the other way around. But anyway, he got 3 million downloads. I mean, that's serious, okay? 3 million. That's a big deal. So it's a sign, and of course it's not surprising because he's had this remarkable career in public service, but he's also been equally prolific in his writing. He's going to speak about one of his books now, and he just mentioned to me as we were chatting that he's going to come up with another book that hopefully is an extrapolation of his Oxford Union lecture on the impact of the British Empire on India. So my third and final point is about the topic he's addressing, and frankly, there could not be a more timely topic than this one, because I guarantee you one thing with absolute confidence, which is that the role of India in the world is going to rise. And it's going to rise because it cannot fall. I mean, the gap between India's, standing today and what is potential is probably the greatest in the world. So India's impact and footprint on the world is going to grow by leaps and bounds. Again, some of you, I think, were here yesterday when Denny Kwa and I spoke on globalization. I mentioned to you all then that if you have time, do go and watch the video that's just been put on YouTube. You might get the impression I go to YouTube all the time. Of DPM Tharman Shanmugaratnam being invited by Prime Minister Modi to speak for about almost an hour on what India could do to realize its potential. And of course, DPM Tharman, as usual, gave a brilliant speech. But if you look at that speech, you get a very good feel also of what India's potential is in the world. So we must clearly thank Shashi Tharoor for taking his time to come and speak again at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He's a dear friend, both of me and of the school, and I'm very happy to welcome Shashi to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore, for those very, very kind words. It is true, we actually first met 35 years ago, and I had newly arrived as head of the office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees here, and was making my ritual courtesy call on the foreign minister. And Kishore was, whatever the title, Assistant Director General or whatever for international organizations. And I was an international organization. So he came and joined me in the waiting room before we went in. And almost one of the first things he told me was, as our Prime Minister has said, he said, quoting Lee Kuan Yew, for whom the school is named, if we don't grow calluses on our heart, we will bleed to death. So I always tease Kishore about it. He had a fierce black beard in those days and was quite a solemn figure, except after hours. But it's been great to be associated with him, to see him through his own extraordinary rise in the international community, to celebrate various landmarks with him. His 50th birthday in New York, his taking over of this institution and building it up to what is now clearly one of the premier institutions of international affairs on the world stage. And I really congratulate Kishore for what he's done with the LKY school, and to all the students from it here, who I think are in many, many ways beneficiaries of his vision as well as his persistent hard work in making LKY what it's already become in such a relatively short time. So as Kishore mentioned, the title of the book comes from a book of mine from 2012, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century. It's available from Penguin or on Amazon or whatever. But it's actually, the talk is going to go beyond the book. The book is really a look at what I believe the world is shaping up to be and India's place in it, but it's also incorporates into it a more conventional study of Indian foreign policy, India's engagement with and relations with a number of the key players, actors, as you can imagine, US, China, Southeast Asia, Africa, the whole issue of India's soft power, India and the United Nations. All of these themes are explored in the book. I'm not going to do all of that in this talk, because the reason I refer to the title is because, of course, it's been often misunderstood. People have accused me of being the votary of some sort of Indian world domination, rather like Pax Romana or Pax Britannica. Perish the thought. All I meant was, and I say this in the book, that I see India as the epitome in many ways of the kind of approach that will privilege the development of cooperative relations amongst countries in an increasingly networked and multipolar world. I'm not interested in any country's domination of this world. I am not tempted by notions of world leadership, or even some of those commentators who rashly said India would be the next superpower. I said in one of my many notorious YouTube moments, how can we be a superpower when we are still super poor? Which did not win me a lot of fans, but we do have domestic problems as well to attend to. The fact is that, in my view, India's role that's interesting is in helping shape an emerging global network, which is what is already beginning to and will, in my view, define international relations and world politics in the 21st century. Now, I'm conscious that I'm here in an academic institution, and I was told by a well-meaning friend that you must give them all takeaways. There must be specific points they will remember. So I thought about points, and I remembered President Wilson's famous 14 points to end the First World War, which prompted the French president of the day, Georges Clemenceau, to say, 14 points? Even the good God only needed 10. So, mindful that my aspirations must stop short of that magical 10, let me try and give you 9 points to take away from the larger theme today of the world in the 21st century and India's place in it. So the first point really is that there's no escaping globalization. In many ways, it's not in fashion anymore to say that. We've seen a backlash against globalization epitomized by a certain, even more floppy-haired political figure in the US these days, and others. But having led a fairly globalized life myself, I'm a child of Keralite parents, born in London, brought up in Bombay, went to high school in Calcutta, college in Delhi, graduate school on the east coast of the US, joined the United Nations in Geneva, worked in Singapore and Geneva, and then in New York, and finally ended up representing Thiruvananthapuram, the capital of Kerala, which I noticed Kishore wasn't brave enough to try and pronounce, in New Delhi. And so having in a sense drunk from the mother's milk of globalization myself, I've become a bit of a votary of it. But really the whole idea of a world increasingly knit together is increasingly a commonplace. And I have to confess, one of my favorite examples of it, some of you may have heard this before, especially if you have Kishore's habit of trawling YouTube, is you know how the headlines that went around the world a few years ago during the 10th anniversary of the tragic death of Princess Diana. Now, what's that got to do with globalization, you may ask? Well, think of it this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with her Egyptian companion, who has supplanted a Pakistani. They get into a German car with a Dutch engine and are driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish liquid. They're then chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese-built motorcycles into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and now the whole story is being told to you by an Indian MP from Thiruvananthapuram here in Singapore. So that's globalization. But I say this because in talking about India, the fact is that if that is today's commonplace, it certainly wasn't the instinctive wisdom of my country, because for us, self-reliance and economic self-sufficiency, rather than connection to the global economy, were a mantra for more than 4 decades after independence. And there were real doubts as to whether India should be more integrated with the world. And whereas today in Singapore, most people associate capitalism with freedom, our nationalist leaders associated capitalism with slavery, because the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. And so the suspicion very much was that any foreigner with a briefcase was the thin end of a neo-imperial wedge. Yes, they say they want to invest and trade, but what they really want to do is rule you. That's what we learned from the East India Company. So the protectionist barriers went up, self-reliance, as I said, became the mantra, and instead of integrating India into the global capitalist system, as only a handful of post-colonial countries like Singapore did and took on the courage to do, India and India's leaders were convinced that the political independence they had fought so long and hard for could only be guaranteed by economic independence. And the result was that we spent the first 45 years really after independence with bureaucrats rather than businessmen on the commanding heights of the Indian economy, wasting, perhaps some would say, or at least with the best of intentions, spending the first 4.5 decades in trying to regulate stagnation, subsidize unproductivity, and distribute poverty, which only goes to prove that one of the lessons you can learn from history is that history can sometimes teach you the wrong lessons. Now, I say this because it's important to understand the extent of the paradigm shift that was needed for a country like India to give up the cherished assumptions of its independence movement and chart a new course. It took a world-class financial crisis in 1991 to prompt India to make that change, with our then finance minister, subsequently prime minister, Manmohan Singh, saying memorably to Parliament, paraphrasing Victor Hugo, that no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. And that idea was the liberalization of the Indian economy. And while in the 25 years since his speech, we've had governments of every conceivable political stripe in India, from the BJP to a government in which the Communist Party of India was a participant, despite that, nobody has reversed the economic liberalization policies announced by Manmohan Singh in 1991. In fact, the space for integration into the globalized system has only grown. So today, to be a young person in the equivalent, there is no equivalent of the LKY school, but of the wannabe LKY schools in India, it can mean for a young person waking up to an alarm clock made in Taiwan perhaps, or China maybe, downing a cup of tea from leaves first planted by the British, donning jeans designed in America and taking a Japanese scooter or a Korean car to get to an Indian corporate office or get to a university like this, where your official reports may be printed or your textbooks might be printed with German invented technology on paper first pulped in Sweden. You might call your friends on a Finnish mobile phone if you're still stuck with a Nokia, if your parents haven't been too generous, or a Chinese one, as more and more is happening, to invite them to an Italian pizza, or even what you think of as an Indian meal, featuring naan that came to us from Persia, tandoori chicken taught to us by rulers who originated in Uzbekistan, and aloo and hari mirch, or potatoes and green chilies, that first came to India only 400 years ago from Latin America. And of course, the most nationalistic thing of all is suspicion of anything foreign. I mean, that is the Indian experience. Now, in such a world, of course, issues that seem very far away once are very much in your backyard. And the choices you make, whether it's in India, whether it's in Singapore, what you buy, how you vote, can resound far away. As someone once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. We're all interconnected, and we can no longer afford the luxury of not thinking about the rest of the planet in anything we do. And I stress this because when I was a lot younger than the youngest person in this room, one of the favorite jokes I was told that I still remember was about the Singaporean mouse. You heard about this? All right, so there's this bunch of mice in a house in India who, I beg your pardon, a bunch of cats, Singaporean cat is the story, a bunch of cats in this house in India being pestered by this really, really troublesome mouse. And the mouse would live in a hole in the wall, and whenever it came out, it would bother the cats and go retreat right back into the hole. And whenever the cats went to lay in wait to catch the mouse, their mewing would alert the mouse to their presence, and the mouse wouldn't come out. And it only came out when it knew the coast was clear and things were safe. So one day a cat comes visiting from Singapore, next door neighbor's cat. And it says to these Indian cats, so what seems to be the problem? And the Indian cat said, this is the problem, you know, this mouse keeps bothering us. When we stand near the hole, it hears our mewing and it just doesn't come out. So the Singaporean cat says, leave it to me. And he goes to the mouse hole and he says, woof, woof. So the mouse, thinking there's just a friendly dog outside, comes out. The Singaporean cat promptly grabs it and says to the Indian cats, thank God my parents always taught me the importance of knowing a second language. That is a lesson now that all of us around the world have to learn. Second, there is a paradox at the heart of our globalized new world. When we think of globalization, of all these forces irresistibly transforming our world, we think also of the information technology revolution that brings to our breakfast tables and our living rooms, our computers and our mobile phones, snippets of information and glimpses of events from far corners of the globe. These are what you might call the forces of convergence, which have made the world one village, one market, one audience. But the opposite also exists. We have to think about the changes that terrorism and conflict have also wrought in the world in the aftermath of 9/11 in America, 26/11 in Mumbai, the war on terror, the rise in violent manifestations of intolerance, and of course the wars going on in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and elsewhere. These are the forces of disruption that threaten, indeed if they already have created, disruption, divisions between haves and have-nots, between North and South, and between people of different creeds and cultures and religions. In other words, the very forces that through globalization are pulling us together seem at the very same time through international terrorism to be driving us apart. This is the defining paradox of our age, and living with this paradox is at the heart of the challenges of this brave new world. But third, and this is where India finally comes in, globalization and its forces don't only flow in one direction. When the Indian industrialist Jamshedji Tata was denied admission to Pike's Hotel in Bombay in the 1890s, at the peak of the British Empire, he built a grander, more opulent hotel that was open to Indians, the Taj Mahal Hotel. So Pike's had a sign outside that said Indians and dogs not allowed, but the Taj Mahal Hotel didn't have such a sign. I don't know about the dogs, but the Indians could go in, and the result was that Taj is today considered one of the finest hotels in the world, whereas Pike's has long since closed. When the same Mr. Tata set up India's first ever steel mill, or tried to, in the first decade of the 20th century, in the teeth of implacable British hostility, a senior imperial official sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of making. It's a pity he didn't live long enough to see the descendants of Mr. Tata taking over what remained of British steel through Tata's acquisition of Chorus in 2006 and its subsequent decision to sell Chorus in 2016. That might have given him a bad case of indigestion. And of course, I wonder what he would have felt when that internet meme went around that some of the youngsters here must have seen on WhatsApp or Facebook last year, when the now lamented David Cameron, who I gather has come and addressed you all already, won his re-election and went off to Buckingham Palace to claim his mandate in what the meme described as an Indian car, the Jaguar, owned by Tatas, right, escorted by British police, and another Indian car, a Land Rover. Enough to give you a little post-colonial frisson, I'm sure. But my point is not just to score cheap debating points, it's to set aside the stereotypes of who can and cannot excel at what in our globalizing world. A generation ago, everything, the tallest, the biggest, the best, was either by or in the United States. Today, that's simply no longer the case. The smartest executive jets are made not by Boeing or Lear or whatever, but by Embraer of Brazil. The tallest building in the world is currently in Dubai, which overtook the previous tallest building in Taipei, which overtook the one in Malaysia that had overtaken the one in Chicago to become the world's tallest building. The world's biggest plane is being built in Russia and Ukraine. The Challenger to the Panama Canal, cutting through Nicaragua, is being built by China. The biggest shopping mall in the world is in Beijing. And the country with the highest per capita income is not the United States, but Singapore. 30 years ago, every one of these categories would have been headed by the United States. The US sure remains the world's sole superpower, but others are catching up fast in various areas where once it alone had been dominant. It's not so much, as has been said before, the decline of the West as the rise of the rest. Growth projections for Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRIC countries or the regional BRIC countries, indicate that they will collectively overtake the original G7's share of global GDP by 2040, some say, 2050, some say, but no one disagrees that within that decade, the G7 will be eclipsed by the BRIC. A couple of decades ago, to give you a different example, no one would have mentioned India and high technology in the same breath. The migration to America of a few Indian engineers in the early 1960s started a different trend. That helped create a new perception of India amongst those with whom they worked. The engineers had a solid grounding in their field in the places like the Indian Institutes of Technology in India. They excelled in the freedom afforded to them in the US, the resources available to them there. And what happened? An Indian invented the Pentium chip, another Indian created Hotmail, a third helped start Sun Microsystems, and Indians have been involved in some 40% of all the startups in Silicon Valley. Over time, the Indianness of engineers and software developers has been taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence. Today, Indians speak of the IITs with the same reference they used to accord to MIT. The image of India has changed from that of a backward developing country to a sophisticated land that produces engineers and computer experts. In fact, this has gone so far from the image that I encountered when I went there for the first time as a graduate student in 1975, of a land of fakirs lying on beds of nails and snake charmers and people playing the Indian rope trick. When today this image is so transformed into computer experts and mathematical wizards and so on, that a friend of mine encountered an anxiously perspiring European at an airport, Schiphol I think it was, saying, "Oh my gosh, you're Indian, can you help me? I need my laptop to be fixed." You know, the assumption was that if you had to find somebody who could get him out of his dilemma, it would have to be an Indian. The old stereotype, as I said, has now given way to something else, and that change is also part of the change in this globalizing world. Fourth, this new world is a place for diversity. In 1996, Professor Samuel Huntington looked at the globalizing world emerging from the Cold War and propounded his theory of a clash of civilizations. He was, in my view, wrong. The civilizations are not monoliths. Each of the civilizations he analyzed has a great deal of diversity within it that he failed to account for. And religion and culture are merely amongst one of the many variables governing the actions and policies of states. Very often, states with a religion in common may have other differences amongst them. I think my friend, the Pakistani High Commissioner here, will remember the views of the Islamic Republic of Iran on Afghanistan when the Taliban was ruling there. They're both Islamic countries, they're neighbors, they disagreed profoundly on Afghanistan. So all of you, the potential world leaders of tomorrow coming out of the LKY school, will have to know how to live with these paradoxes, and that includes living with contradictions. And I say living with contradictions because, you know, coming from India, the old joke that I have used more often than I can count is that anything I tell you about India, the opposite is also true. And it is often the case. I mean, we like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we are also a young republic. Our IT experts are striding confidently into the 21st century, but the majority of our population still lives in each of the other 20 centuries. But what's interesting about India is that quite often these contradictions coexist quite cheerfully. One of my favorite images of India while we are talking about internet memes is a photograph that went around during the last Kumbh Mela of a Hindu holy man, a naked sadhu, right out of central casting, right? So there he was, completely bare torso, matted long hair, wispy beard, a rudraksha mala around his neck, ash-smeared forehead, his skin hanging in folds from his face and his bony limbs, staring off into space, which would normally have been this cliched picture of timeless otherworldliness. But in this photograph, this naked sadhu staring off into space is busy chatting away on a mobile phone. Now that is the India of today, the land in which ultimately a naked Hindu holy man can comfortably be using a mobile phone, and you have to learn to embrace the possibilities and the complications that represents. You know, when the 20th century began, we had the First World War, and President Wilson, whom I've already mentioned, talked about making the world safe for democracy. I think you can argue that that goal has largely been accomplished. Pretty much every country in the world is a democracy, and those that aren't pretend to be or play lip service to it. Now in the 21st century, I would argue, the challenge, the big challenge facing us all, is to make the world safe for diversity. The truth is that the idea that's familiar to a country like Singapore, a country like India, of multi-ethnic coexistence, the idea that it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is, the kind of food you eat, the sounds you make when you speak, the God you choose to worship or not, as the case may be, so long as you want to play by the same rules as everyone else and you're prepared to dream the same dreams. It is not essential in a diverse democratic world to agree all the time, so long as you can agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. But that hasn't happened just yet. In fact, the American author Benjamin Barber wrote a very interesting book called Jihad versus McWorld. It's the twin prospects facing humanity. Jihad, he wrote, in the name of 100 narrowly conceived faiths, against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself, unquote. Versus a McWorld of globalization run rampant. And I quote again, a world of fast music, fast computers, and fast food, with MTV, Macintosh, and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park, unquote. Now, both jihad and Macworld, of course, end up by obliterating our most precious possession, our own identity, our own consciousness of what makes us different, what makes us special. We need to strive for a world in which we can preserve our individual identities and yet work in cooperation with each other. Obviously, the only answer to that is to fight for, to defend, to promote diversity. But fifth, the new network world is seeing the rise of old problems. We think of religious wars and crusades as relics of medieval history, yet they've come back to haunt us in the second decade of the 21st century, with the rise of ISIS or Daesh now. We can ask ourselves, why are so many political grievances, real or imagined, articulated in religious terms? The answer surely lies in the primordial nature of religious identity. As a writer, I tend to be attracted to what one might call the cultural construct of identity, of which religion is only a part, and to many, not necessarily the most important part. But what you find is that in countries where other avenues of identity mobilization are restricted, as happens in autocratic states, or when it's difficult, as in societies where political patterns are entrenched, or where democracy is stifled or curtailed, and few interlopers are admitted, then ordinary people usually tend to fall back upon the one identity that seems basic to them, and that is religion. You know, it's interesting, Amartya Sen wrote a very, very good book on identity and diversity, in which he argued that we all have multiple identities, and that why can't you give equal weight to being, say, a cricket fan, or in his case, an Oxbridge Don, or in Kishore's case, a prolific writer, or whatever, to being, say, born in a Hindu family. But people who think like that, and I'm probably with Amartya Sen in my own reaction to that, we are a minority in today's world. And it would be unwise for us to ignore the clarion call of religious fanaticism to so many desperate young men, and indeed young women, around the world. And these problems are being reflected in many, many countries, certainly including India. Of course, there can be something precious and valuable about religion, about having something in common with others, stretching their hands out towards God around the world. But can we separate religion from politics? Can we dream of a world in which religion has an honored place, but where the need for spirituality will no longer be associated with the need to belong, with a political identity? Where religion, therefore, will not be the principal unit of identity, and therefore identity will not be the basic driver of politics. If identity can relate principally to citizenship rather than to faith, to a land rather than a doctrine, to a constitution rather than a scripture, and if that identity is one that can live in harmony with other identities, then we might resist both jihad and Macworld. I think if we all come to understand and accept this notion that all of us has multiple identities, then perhaps we can assert each of them at different times and different places without attacking others. That you can be a good Christian in the church, and a good cricket fan at the stadium, and a good student at the school, and be the same person in all three locations. Sixth, from this flows the fact that the old binaries of the Cold War era are no longer relevant. There are no longer two superpowers to be non-aligned between, for example, for a country like India. And so my metaphor for the globalized world's international relations today would be that of the World Wide Web. In this increasingly networked world, we are going to have to work through multiple networks. And those networks will sometimes overlap with one another, with common memberships, but sometimes they will be distinct or have some common members and not others. They'll all serve our interests in different ways and for different purposes. Let me give you the Indian example again. So every year, our foreign minister meets with her Russian and Chinese counterparts in something called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the South Africans for the annual summit, or the annual foreign ministers meeting too, of the BRICS. Then she takes out the Russians and the Chinese, and she meets with the other two in something called IPSA, for South-South cooperation. And then to IPSA, she adds the Chinese, but not the Russians, and they meet as BASIC for environmental negotiations. And now India is a member of all these four groupings, not merely because its name happens to begin with that most useful element in every acronym, a vowel, but because it actually has something to contribute to each of these groupings and at the same time derive certain positive benefits from it. Now, this kind of World Wide Web style networking reflects other paradoxes of our world. India, again, since my talk is about India, tries to play an influential role within the United Nations, a universal organization with 193 member states, but it also gives a lot of importance to SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which contains only its 7 neighbors. It belongs both to the non-aligned movement, a reflection of its anti-colonial heritage and its imperial legacy, and there it inveighs against the West, and then it goes off and plays a leading role in the community of democracies alongside the very Western countries that it has been criticizing in the non-aligned movement. It is a leading light of the global trade union of developing countries, the G77, but it's also a leading light of the global management of the world macroeconomy, the G20. Now, all of this seems to be completely contradictory, but in fact, that's the kind of networked world I'm talking about. Because I think we have the great ability to be in these different institutional networks, pursuing different objectives with different allies and partners, and in each finding a valid purpose that suits us. This is why during my brief stint as minister in our foreign ministry, I somewhat rashly suggested that India was moving beyond non-alignment to what I dubbed multi-alignment. I have to admit the phrase never caught on, but it is the thought that we have come to a point where we can truly align ourselves in different configurations and patterns at different times with different countries. Now, we all know that in the 21st century world, you young people here are likely to spend most of your lives interacting with people who don't look, sound, dress, or eat like you. You may grow up to run an internationally oriented company with clients, colleagues, or investors from around the globe. And you are likely to take your holidays in far-flung destinations. The world is going to be full of such opportunities. But along with these opportunities will also come threats that didn't exist a generation ago. Terrorism, of course, but also transnational crime syndicates, counterfeiters of currency, drug smugglers, child traffickers, internet spammers, credit card crooks, and even imported illnesses like the Zika virus that's been dominating our headlines for the last couple of days. So wouldn't you want your government to devise policies to deal with such challenges that would affect your and one day your children's lives? Should such policies in an ever more networked world even be called foreign? Now, one of the reasons that foreign policy matters today, while you're coming to a place like the Lee Kuan Yew School, is that foreign policy is no longer merely foreign. It affects you right here where you live, wherever you live. All of us want our governments to seize the opportunities that the 21st century world provides, while managing the risks and protecting you from the threats that this world has also opened you up to. And this, I must stress, is what my idea of Pax Indica is all about. I believe the distinction between domestic and international is less and less meaningful in today's world, where one is tied to the other much more closely than it might appear on the surface. Clearly, you've seen this here, right here in Singapore, because you are an extraordinarily globalized country. But even in a country like India, where even to this day, less than 50% of our GDP growth is accounted for by the external sector, by foreign trade, we have become conscious that economic decisions made half a world away, oil price increases, commodity price plummeting, the Chinese renminbi, all of these things can actually bring down state governments in India, affect national elections in our country. Seventh, this involves working for change. This is the politician in me coming out. A fact is that the dominance of a handful of small industrialized Western countries, especially in the international financial institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods organizations, looks increasingly anomalous in a world where economic dynamism has been shifting irresistibly from west to east. The emergence of new powers and forces which were omitted from the high table in 1945. China was included in the high table on the political side and the Security Council. It was omitted from the Bretton Woods institutions' leadership. We have now clearly reached a point where a global redesign, a system redesign of global governance has been called for. We need to have how a system which will enable countries like China in the Bretton Woods institutions, like India in the Security Council, to participate in a manner commensurate with their capacity. Because as the line goes, you're either at the table or on the menu. And a country like India spent a long time being a rule taker in international affairs. It now feels rightly ready to join the rule makers and participate in constructing the international system, and thereby claiming a seat at the table. It has the capacity, the experience, the track record, and the technology to play an increasingly significant role in managing the global commons on issues ranging from cyberspace to outer space, which are both examples of areas where India has a capacity that only a handful of countries does. Why shouldn't it be amongst those helping to shape the future of the globe's management of both cyberspace and outer space? So I'm suggesting, therefore, that India in this world networked system must play an increasing role in pushing for a redistribution of power, not only in the UN Security Council, where perhaps we've been speaking most often and the loudest, but also in the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Our participation in the new development bank under the BRICS is very much conscious, I think, of the fact that setting it up will provide an alternative to the West-dominated World Bank and IMF. And as for the political organizations of global governance, I don't want to go into a lengthy discussion of that unless somebody asks in the Q&A. It seems to me it's simply not reasonable to run the world's premier international organization on the basis of the geopolitical realities of 1945 rather than those of 2016. To say that something must be a particular way because 5 countries happen to have won a war 70 years ago just doesn't stand up to any kind of rational logic. Eighth, the mass media is vital today, but it's not enough. You cannot hope to succeed in the 21st century without the mass media. We all understand that, even in international relations. Public diplomacy, soft power, these are things that are talked about much more. The use of mass media to influence world publics, not just diplomacy by people in pinstripe suits in closed-door chancelleries. And the fact is that I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk how new communications technology has shrunk the world. But I do want to complement it by saying that we must recognize that global mass media still reflects principally the interests of its producers. What passes for international culture, for example, is still usually the culture of the economically developed world. Yes, there is an occasional third world voice, but it speaks a first world language. And this is not new. As far back as the first Congo Civil War of 1962, the journalist Edward Baer recounts going around a camp of violated Belgian nuns and seeing a TV cameraman with his mic out saying, "Anybody here been raped and speaks English?" It wasn't enough to have suffered the horrors of rape. You had to have suffered and be able to express your suffering in the language acceptable to the journalist. It's a very powerful metaphor. That is what still is the case for the media. Now, can the internet compensate? To some degree, yes, because in the internet, of course, you don't have to go through the filter of the mass media. But whereas in the West, penetration has now crossed 90% in most countries, and in fact, Finland has even declared broadband a human right on a par with food and water, it's simply not yet true in the developing world. In India, for example, our internet access, according to a World Bank 2016 estimate, is still only 15%. Now, this will change as 4G is rolled out and smartphones become more accessible and more affordable. And I'm fully confident that within a decade, a majority of Indians, not 15%, will have access to the internet through their handheld devices. And then, believe me, the world will change. 500 million Indian villagers connected to the global village. You all better watch out. Because, the fact is that as of now, and certainly it's true in Africa, it's true in many parts of the world, even in parts of Southeast Asia, the information revolution is not like the French Revolution. You have a lot of liberty, some fraternity, but no equality. And that has not changed yet. And so I think if you're thinking about international relations tomorrow, you have to think not only about the poverty line, which is an important line for leaders of tomorrow to be conscious of, but also the high-speed digital line, the fiber optic line, all the lines that both connect us and divide us, that exclude those who are literally not plugged in to the possibilities of our brave networked world. The key to the internet divide is still the computer keyboard. Those who do not have one risk marginalization, and you can't afford to forget them. If you can recognize both the potential and the limitations of today's media, the 21st century could yet become a time of mutual understanding such as we've never seen before. And that is what India will work for through its emphasis, for example, on multi-stakeholder governance of the internet. A world in which it is now easier than ever before to meet strangers must also become a world in which it should be easier than ever before to see strangers not as objects of hatred or suspicion, but as really no different from ourselves. Ninth and finally, I just want to say to the students here that each of you has a role to play in ensuring that ours is a better world for us having been in it. I do believe that as citizens of a new networked world, we have a responsibility to think of those who are not as fortunate as us. Amongst our own colleagues, amongst those of us around the world. And that's why India has always tried to speak for a larger idea of humanity in the United Nations and global forums, whether it's for democracy, whether it's for development, earlier years, for decolonization, for anti-apartheid. These have all been causes that India considered important to stand up for. And you as individuals, I think, whatever your nationalities, are capable of doing the same in this world. Kishore was reminding me of the days when I was here in Singapore running the UN's program for Vietnamese boat people who were rescued at sea and brought into the port. It was an extraordinary growing experience, but the most satisfying thing about it was that I could put my head to the pillow at night, knowing the things I had done during the day, people I had persuaded, whether immigration officers or foreign ministers, that I had done things that had made a difference to real human beings' lives. That was an extraordinary privilege for a young man, and at the same time, I think it's a privilege each of you can also enjoy, not necessarily in the same way, but in whatever path you choose to embark upon for yourselves. Now, we're all like Egyptian mummies. We're strapped for time, and I know that Kishore wanted me to leave a credible amount of time for Q&A, so let me just briefly pull my strands together. My basic point is that we have to think beyond ideas of world leadership, global domination, conventional international relations, to cooperative relationships in a networked world. And that's the kind of world India should be part of. Sovereign nation states will, of course, continue proudly to guard their sovereignty, and so will India. But the world will inevitably push them together in ways that transforms the very definition of the word sovereignty and dilutes its own meanings. The ultimate purpose of any country's foreign policy must be the security and well-being of its own citizens. India is no exception there. But the old autarkic ways of doing this throwing up barriers, hostility to neighbors, this kind of thing is simply not going to work anymore. Those who are trying it are failing. Most of us, after all, in this room, belong to countries that proudly celebrate our Independence Day. Fair enough. But the time may come, it seems to me, when we realize that what we really ought to celebrate the rest of the time, the other days, is something else. The recognition that every other day in our calendar in this globalized world is really an interdependence day. Thank you all for listening to me so patiently.